bottom line is if I could arm that person with the skills and resources so that they don't ever have to have an answer, but they always know where to find the answer through other resources or through experts all the time. They always have the skill set of being strategic. That's like teaching them how to fish versus giving them fish.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we have a very special guest for you, Joe Walsh, coach, educator, and advisor at Supply Chain Sherpas. Garry, I don't want to waste any time. I want to get right to the interview. Joe has really established himself as a giant in healthcare supply chain. He's impacted so many people and so many organizations, and he's just got so much information for us today to share that I think every single one of us, including you, me, and Hayes, can take home and put into our, work lives starting tomorrow.
Yeah, I think we're really fortunate to have Joe on this episode. I think our biggest problem is going to be keeping him, within the time frame we want allotted. This might be a Joe Rogan blown up podcast that just keeps moving forward. So moving forward, we might have him on a second time, but he has got such a wealth of knowledge. And I know a few of us have heard him speak in the past, and he just knows the depth, and just looking forward to see what he has to say today. So what a pleasure to have Joe on Power Supply on this episode.
We're going to be right back after a short break with Joe Walsh.
I'm Hayes Waldrop.
This is Garry Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now, an industry legend, Joe Walsh, coach, educator, advisor at Supply Chain Sherpas. Joe, I know this has been in the works for a while, but we are so excited to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for coming on.
Wonderful, Justin. It's an honor to be here.
He is a legend.
He is a legend.
He is.
Right?
I'm telling you, man.
You're talking about the Joe Walsh, the guy from the Eagles.
Oh,
right?
wait. Which one is this? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry to disappoint.
I
do this constantly.
Well, I'm glad
I
you're here.
disappoint people constantly.
You get
but
this
I'm
all
happy
the
to be here.
What a start.
Well, we're going to be talking about fundamental change today, right? So it's all about preventive versus rescue care and supply chain. And there is a whole lot of rescuing going on these days. But Joe, I'd love for you to talk about your personal story, your background, and really how you found your way into being a coach and an educator and really a mentor to a lot of people in this industry today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate kind of the opportunity to kind of share a little bit of background. My background really began in supply chain and business development in completely different industries altogether. I was outside of healthcare in industries like consumer products and food service. And then I lost both my parents in two different healthcare systems 4 months apart from each other. And what I got to experience is probably most of us have experienced on some level, right? A very personal experience with our healthcare system. And I was inspired to kind of come into our industry and now make a very meaningful difference. And so for me, I spent time in Intermountain Healthcare, and then I spent time at UPMC. But what I realized is that the root cause of, I think, where we need to make some fundamental changes has more to do with the leadership opportunities we have and how we make leaders be better leaders. And that's how we really create movement. And so that's why I'm now, helping leaders become better leaders as an executive coach. And we have a leadership development practice, and we help suppliers and providers on both sides of the equation to do so.
I've heard so many conversations about how do we get supply chain, to the boardroom, to the C-suite. And unfortunately, I almost feel like it took a pandemic, and now all of a sudden, that's there. But also there was a lot of specialization and diversifying in supply chain. And I think that's why we now, there's strategic sourcing, and there's so many different sort of areas that you can work in. But one thing that we've learned is there's just a shortage, not only of leaders, but of just talent entering the industry, specifically for healthcare, for quite a while now. And many of them leave and go into consulting, or they go into industry jobs. So, that whole leadership piece, a lot of the times organizations can find themselves starved for leadership. And so I just want to echo what you said. I think it's really, really important that you begin to develop leaders pretty much the day they start at your organization, so that you always have that redundancy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, Justin, I agree with everything that you're saying, including the origin of, supply chain kind of getting moved into the C-suite and also being elevated in terms of strategic importance. And then that just kind of putting this need for leaders, I think, into a different spotlight than it's ever been in before. And to kind of just, I think, emphasize what you said, not only are we losing talent, people are leaving their roles because the job itself is very, very stressful, and there's a growing need for supply chain talent that we can't keep up with in terms of the demand is exceeding the supply of available talent, and we're competing now with other industries. But I think we also make this mistake very often, where we assume because somebody is really great at sourcing, or really great at purchasing, or really great at logistics as an expert, that will somehow make them, great at leadership, which is a completely different skill set. And so, what got us here doesn't always get us there. We do this with physicians as well. Just because you're a really great surgeon doesn't mean that you will become a really great CEO without actually pausing the surgery and then creating the space and time to actually learn leadership, which is just as specialized as surgery. Same thing for supply chain leaders. We have to kind of pause just for a moment in time what we're doing as an expert and create the space to actually learn new skills and competencies. We don't actually give people the time to do that.
I totally agree with that, Joe. I mean, the other side of that would be a sales rep who's just killing it in a territory, and then they promote him or her into the leadership and they don't do well. Or, the all-pro linebacker who's the best Hall of Famer, he does not mean he can coach. It's a totally different skill set.
Totally agree, Hayes. The sales one is a really great example where, our business is kind of split. We have half of our business is working with, sales and commercial teams, and half of our business is working with supply chain. And this problem, or this opportunity, if you want to look at it that way, is parallel. It exists on both sides of the business. We take people with the best of intentions and say, because you're really good as a sales, let's say, person, you know how to close business. We're just going to assume that you know how to lead people. And those two things often are unrelated. I wouldn't even say they're related. They're sometimes unrelated. What made you really great as an expert in your job sometimes doesn't make you very proficient at leading others to do that same thing.
I think it's related to detail and focus, right? So a lot of times when you're in one of those roles, what makes you so good is that you are immersed in every detail. And so that the final product of your effort, whatever that looks like, is amazing and it's recognized. The problem is a lot of times, especially if you're promoted into leadership, right? You could be a leader in that department and you might still survive that initial wave because you have the experience to share that detail orientation and expertise so that the people around you just flourish as a result of your knowledge and experience. But there's this one step that happens where I think everybody breaks without that specific leadership training like you were just describing. And it's where all of a sudden they can't be connected at that detail level. And I almost feel like that's when all of a sudden it really comes out that you weren't investing in teaching them the skills, because no longer is it they're responsible for all the details. It's them leading people on how to do that fundamentally, not with every critical step that gets executed along the way. Is that something that you've seen in your leadership training when that happens?
Yeah, Justin, that's incredibly insightful. What happens is when people go from, being the person who's the expert, let's just take somebody who's leading, who's actually a sourcing individual. And then we put them into a supervisory role. So now they're leading a team of sourcing professionals. That first step to be kind of like a team leader is often not met with a lot of resistance or failure, because largely the job is not too dissimilar from doing the job itself. In fact, in many ways, you're helping others do that job from an expert level. I've been there, I've done that, so let me help you do the same job the same way I've done it, or let me help you learn the lessons I've learned along the way. However, when you move even beyond that step, so let's say from manager to director, or certainly director to VP, which is where we usually see things really start to come unraveled for folks if they don't invest in leadership skills, then the competencies are totally different. Now you're orchestrating, you're no longer doing that work. So your skill sets in actually knowing how to source are no longer as relevant as your ability to now influence change in the organization. Go and enroll stakeholders in a wildly different way. And we're talking executive stakeholders who are at a peer level, not category leaders. So again, the skill sets necessary for success are wildly different when you get to that VP level than they are at, like, let's say, a team lead level or a team manager level. So often the problems don't start to manifest until we get into higher level positions. And then they become really obvious if we haven't actually invested all along the way.
So I never really thought about that. I always thought about it like maybe, the training for leading people, but I never thought about it from the perspective of leading the vision with your peers. That is really important. There's like a networking kind of component to that I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily consider when they're looking to be promoted. So when we've already established that there's this lack of leadership in general, I think this goes way outside of supply chain too. I think this is a fundamental flaw in a lot of organizations, especially as they get larger. And the easiest move is to promote the all-star on the team than to really look at and foster leadership so that there's some resiliency there. But we hear a lot about emergency preparedness, right? And a lot of times it's about resources locally. It could be nowadays having a diverse supply chain and suppliers that aren't just over the ocean, as, it's like Garry's favorite OTO. But I think from that whole same concept as leadership preparedness, because what happens when you're in an emergency? All of a sudden, it takes great leaders to carry you through. So I think people might be overlooking the importance of great leadership during those events of an emergency or urgent situation. So can you talk about leadership preparedness and what that should look like, especially with a lot of the lessons that we've learned recently?
Yeah, talk about emergency preparedness or leadership preparedness?
Leadership preparedness in the context of emergency preparedness.
The context I might provide there is that emergency preparedness is a strategy and an infrastructure that obviously in supply chain we have learned we need to create. And some organizations were further ahead of others in creating that infrastructure before COVID. But now I don't think there's any organization left standing, who doesn't understand the importance of emergency preparedness. And that emergency preparedness is part of something much larger called resiliency building, as well as resiliency building being part of something even broader than that called risk management, which is part of something even bigger than that called business continuity. So why am I saying all that? Well, because frankly, those are strategies. Those are tactics. That's infrastructure we all need to build. The topic today is emergency preparedness, and a wildly important one, but the topic tomorrow might be something different. Yesterday was data standards. The topics of strategy change all the time. But what actually doesn't change is the need for the leadership preparedness in order to actually not only have the vision for those strategies before they're necessary, because there's time to develop them and implement them, but also to see the next ones coming and the ability to actually do something with them. And I think that's what we continue to underestimate is the need for the leadership preparedness to be the leader of the organization we need to be tomorrow, not the one we are today, and to actually invest in those skills and resources to prepare ourselves to lead our organizations into the future. So we're not always playing from behind, which is probably what it feels like for so many people sitting in those roles, is that they're just drinking from a fire hose. I actually really empathize with what they might be feeling right now. There's no time right now for them to go and invest in themselves, and it's almost too late to do so because this current challenge, emergency preparedness, is, I'll call it flavor of the day for right now. It is so white hot, they cannot not do something with it. And therefore, that strategy is only going to get so far, and it's only going to get as far as their leadership preparedness will allow them to.
Joe, I really like the point of you making, stay in your lane and what true leaders are and focusing on what you're really good at and staying there. But I want to talk a little bit and go a little deeper on your discussion of the strategy, the vision, the crystal ball, if you will, to see the future and building those teams. Like, what is the leader these days looking at? I mean, we've been trained on Strength Finders 2.0 and your color wheel and how you motivate people and how you move people. But from that leader that's really looking at the dichotomy of the diverse team, how do you help them get on board tactically with what's going to happen in the future and be prepared for it as a true gifted leader? What are some of your observations or your strategies that you focus on the team environment?
Yeah, Gary, it's a really great question. And when we're talking about let's say the competency of how do you become more strategic, right? If that's maybe the competency we would try to help somebody develop, that is an important competency. In fact, we do surveys every couple of years for account managers. So if you're a key account manager, we do this, and we also do it for supply chain leaders. And inevitably, the leadership competency of being strategic is always number one. It's the number one need and the number one gap. So no question, that's super important. And I think what's important for leaders to recognize is they don't need to actually have that vision. They need to know how to crowdsource where things are going to be a year or 2 or 3 years from now. And then they need to know how to enroll their teams in solutioning so that they can actually get to that destination. I mean, leaders are really, really good at actually not having the answers, but knowing who to go to actually get those answers. So what I wouldn't do, Gary, is I wouldn't necessarily, put a roadmap together of here's what I predict. And I'm asked this question all the time. What do I predict is going to happen in the healthcare supply chain 2 or 3 years from now? My response inside is always like, who cares what I think, right? Because whatever I think probably isn't going to be accurate and it's going to change anyways. The bottom line is if I could arm that person with the skills and resources so that they don't ever have to have that answer, but they always know where to find the answer through other resources or through experts all the time. They always have the skill set of being strategic. That's like teaching them how to fish versus giving them fish.
Joe is bringing it today.
I love how you emphasize that networking is that key aspect of leadership. And, you were just talking about strategy being one of the clear competencies, but what are some other competencies that all leaders should have or develop? Maybe that's a better thing to say. What are some other competencies that leaders should be thinking about developing?
Yeah. And I mean, this is again, based on a crowdsourced, set of survey responses. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of responses that have actually come in on both sides of the equation. And this isn't just supply chain leaders, but, Hayes, this would apply to folks that are running national accounts as well. Relationship building and collaboration. That's the second competency. Second highest perceived importance and second highest perceived gap in the preparedness of leaders having those skill sets. Communications, I've been in supply chain, right, leading supply chain functions. And it's very, very difficult to actually sit down and write targeted communications that are tailored for specific audiences. I mean, so what we tend to do is just not do it. Because it's a skill set in and of itself to do executive level communications out to the organization. That's number 3. Number 4 is change management. Not just hoping people change because you've given them some logical, pragmatic reason to do so, but recognizing that's not the order in which people do things differently. We always ask people's hands to do something different, so we tell them something logically, and that's not the way that change happens. Change happens because we capture people's hearts first, and then we logically explain to them why something needs to happen differently. And then we explain to them how to do the work differently. And it has to be done in that 1, 2, 3 order. There's entire methodologies for how to do this. So just like there's a sourcing methodology, there is a methodology for how to implement major change in big, complex organizations. And there's a way you can learn this. It's not like leaders are born, leaders are made. And we have to make sure that we give them those skills. Those are the top 4 competencies that we see pretty routinely emphasized as being critically important. And often, even the leaders themselves are self-reporting that they don't feel as prepared as they would like to.
Joe, I love how you're talking amongst your team and how you incorporate that. In supply chain, we are set up with a diverse group that we are engaged with all over the board. Some days we're talking to IT And you never know what size of the brain they're going to use, right or left. It's a whole different skill set, and sometimes you can't speak the language. Sometimes you'll talk to a surgeon. Sometimes you'll talk to that nurse that's in the OR that has to be type A and has to get things done for the patient. How do we go outside our teams to engage in as strategies as we try to work in that bigger system organization too? What are some thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, we have this framework that's called the SCORE, SCORE. And we actually not only give all of our kind of, advisory clients, but we give it to all of our coaching clients as well. And the idea is that there's a framework inside a business to business environment. So if you're in supply chain working with an internal stakeholder, or even if you're in account management trying to work with supply chain, each person inside the organization has one of 5 different languages of value. Just like there's this thing called love languages that hopefully we all subscribe to, and not every person wants to be kind of spoken to or approached in the same way. There's one of 5 ways. We have learned that in healthcare, there are 5 different languages that people typically prefer. And if you can learn their language, your probability of being influential with them and highly trustworthy in their eyes is exponentially higher. And I mean, just to keep this simple, the languages are that person is either very strategic, they're clinically oriented, they're operationally oriented, they're relationship oriented, or they're economically oriented. And if you can actually keep your conversations and all the things you're doing with that person in their preferred language and in their preferred language of, their value language, as we call it, then I mean, the probability of you actually kind of being, I would say, relevant and credible with that person is so much higher than if you actually just try to be a one size fits all in your approach with each person. So the important part here, Gary, is that you don't approach every person the same way, but there's also not an infinite set of variations in how you approach people. There's like 5. And most of us subscribe to one of those 5
I've been working
languages.
with Garry for over a year, and I have no idea how to communicate with him. I mean, Joe, I don't know what your score is of this dude, but I don't think there's a metric that's made for this guy. So just as an FYI.
I'm the chameleon, man. I'm the chameleon. It's what it is. Sorry, man.
Hey, there's always outliers, right? This is the 80%. There's outliers on both sides.
Alien. He's on the alien.
When they made my prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, there was no amygdala hijack. That's all I got to say. I'm out. That's it right there.
Well, let's talk about that engagement and take that to the next step, right? So first off, you have to understand how to communicate with people to engage them. But there's a whole approach to that to winning them over. And I want to go back to what you said about the importance of leaders being able to engage their peers, but they also still have to engage, people in other departments. And leadership doesn't always happen at a high level. Leadership can happen at any level. And as a matter of fact, it kind of needs to for a culture to thrive. Anybody can be a leader, whether it's not related to title. Leadership is, I guess maybe that's the thing that should just be outright said. Leadership is not related to title. Everybody can take a leadership position. And one of those leadership positions can be approaching IT or approaching clinicians, like you said, Garry. But what's the best way? I want to target clinicians. Maybe it's because I'm a nurse and I always go back to the clinical side. But how do you engage clinicians? Because I feel like sometimes that's a serious source of frustration for supply chain. And sometimes it's been an area where there's been conflict. So I feel like that's always an opportunity, especially for somebody new, but it can happen for people that have been in the industry a long time as well.
This is such a hot topic, Justin, and I'm so glad you asked it. And first of all, I agree with you that everyone can be and is a leader. It has nothing to do with title. And so how do you approach clinicians? Well, can we first talk about what not to do? Because I think in the what not to do category, there's probably meaningful insight within there. What we often see supply chain leaders do, and I've done this. I did this in my early days in supply chain, and I've probably done it more often than I'd like to admit. I like to learn lessons the first time, but I would say with any technical person you're approaching, whether it's IT or somebody clinical, as an example, right? They're in clinical roles. And what you don't want to do is actually approach them as a peer in that conversation as if you are equally technically qualified. And that's where I've seen a lot of supply chains kind of make a significant mistake. We're not trying to sit next to them as clinician peers. We are trying to sit next to them as supply chain peers, where we are as deep in supply chain as they are clinically. I think role clarity is such an important distinction. There's all this talk around clinical integration, which often devolves into one of two conversations. We either become subservient to the clinical agenda, meaning we'll report to the CMO and supply chain just does anything clinical operations wants us to do, which I know that's not what it intends to be, but sometimes that's what it ultimately practically becomes. Or we'll hire clinicians onto our team in supply chain, and then we'll try to sit next to clinicians who don't want to sit next to them anyways, right? What they wanted and what they need is they need a supply chain person sitting there who is as technically capable in supply chain as they are technically capable in clinical operations. That might be maybe an interesting place to kind of pick off on and go in different directions.
Joe, can you say that again, please? Say those two sentences again. I mean, those are so relevant. Will you say it, please, one more time?
Yeah.
Say it out loud.
I'm trying to think if I can
All
say
caps.
it the same way, right? I mean, Garry, you tell me. How about we say it a different way? I mean, you replay it back to me. How did it resonate with you?
You got to have the right. No, Joe. I think when you talk about having the expertise of the different individuals at the table, you've got to be able to combine and intertwine somehow and understand each other's perspective. Because if you don't want to sit next to the same person that if you went to school for 6 years to get what you wanted to do, and this person went to 2, there's this whole tug and pull in the competition. I don't see it working unless there's a transparency, there is direct, intentional conversation, and I think it needs to be probably brought to the table before we even can have anything accomplished together as a team. So this how you said it was way better than I say it in a novel. You said it in 2 sentences, and I've always been long-winded, so I apologize, Joe.
No, Garry, let's give another example, like just to bring some light to this, because I think we're in a clinical business in healthcare. And so a lot of times we place so much emphasis on the clinicians as we should. But I mean, equally important would be, let's say we're working with IT. If we were to put a sourcing person in front of that IT person and they wanted to actually, I don't know, convince the IT person they knew more about IT than they do about sourcing, then obviously IT doesn't need them to do sourcing for them because IT's already got enough functional knowledge of IT. They don't need another person sitting outside their 4 walls to do it for them. I think we all intuitively understand this, but sometimes between supply chain and clinical operations, we get amnesia around this same idea. Like same thing with HR. We don't go to HR benefits as an internal stakeholder and say, I'm in supply chain, but on weekends, I've been studying HR benefits and now I know HR benefits as well as you do. Yeah. Would you like to actually form a study group together? Like we don't do that, right? What we do is we say we know supply chain, you know HR benefits, and together we can accomplish something amazing we couldn't otherwise do alone.
It so sounds appropriate, Joe, because you're making me think about a client that I work with, and we work on specified lab. You want me to explain lab? No, but I need to bring the SME, the subject matter expert, to the room. I can help with negotiation, sourcing, strategy, which I'm good at, and then I can get the SME to help support, and they stay in their lane. So that collaboration, we get so much more done and so much more effective. And that goes with any concept, IS, IT, surgery, pharmacy, any of those supply chain categories that we're supporting. So totally makes sense with what you're saying.
But I would throw this in there maybe as a voice for all those providers out there that are listening to us right now. They'll say, we'll stay in our lane as long as that doctor will stay in his lane and not know everything about supply chain. And so it's got to go both ways, right? Everybody's got to know their way.
That's the leadership piece is how do you handle that situation? Because, it's about value prop. And so if you're going in and presenting that your value is something they already have, then they don't need you. So you need to come in with expertise in an area they don't understand. But to your point, what happens when they come back and say, well, I already know everything that you do. So Joe, I'd love that for you to answer on that. Like what is a good skill for people to keep in mind? Because the immediate move is to counter with the exact same strategy. And that's how you get into the power struggles.
That's exactly right, Justin. I think the knee-jerk reaction is then we need to hire clinicians. And that's the way we're going to build credibility, because we're going to have peers in supply chain that are peers to the folks in clinical operations. But what we're doing when we approach it that way first, I'm not saying that hiring clinicians is the wrong strategy. Of course, it's the right strategy in many cases. It's got to be part of a broader strategy, though. We can't diminish the importance of supply chain itself as a peer function to clinical operations, or a peer function to HR, or a peer function to IT, or any other function that exists in the organization, no more or less important, but necessary for the organization's collective success. We have to be able to, and you said it, articulate the value proposition in very simple language. We are going to work with you from a sourcing perspective because we are process experts. We bring a certain level of analytical rigor that sounds like, and we have to be able to articulate what that analytical rigor looks like and sounds like. We bring a process rigor, and here's what our sourcing process involves. We make sure that we help the organization choose the best suppliers for its given need, and those needs are going to include your needs. We're not involved in this selection process. You are. So we're going to help you extract your own needs out of your clinical operations and anyone else's needs. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to take emotion out of the conversation when we're negotiating with the vendors and with the manufacturers. And we're negotiation experts as well, and contracting experts as well. And you're highlighting and emphasizing things that clinical operations is going to welcome, because these are skill sets and areas of expertise that they don't want. And the only reason they go and develop those areas of expertise, if they have done so, is because they don't trust supply chain to do it for them.
I love process, because process is the way to dehumanize the conflict. If you can shift the focus to the process, you're going to get back on track in terms of partnering much more quickly than staying in the he said, she said, you did this is not your place, and getting into that kind of a struggle. I now want to talk about something that you're leading us right towards. We have these general inclinations. We're going to do things certain ways because it's almost biologically programmed for us to do this dysfunctional reaction every single time we're confronted with conflict. So it requires like this enormous sort of self-awareness and restraint to not do, or literally communication accommodate what that person is doing to us and do the same thing back. So this means we have to change, right? It starts with us. So you mentioned change management as a leadership competency, but can you really do effective change management unless you've changed yourself? And maybe we can start the personal development and the pathway of becoming a leader there.
Yeah, I actually really love the way you've kind of asked that question, because the short answer is no, I don't think we can. I've got this model for leadership that basically says your leadership breakthrough is on the other side of 4 different dimensions, the 4S model, as we call it. And I'm going to tell it in reverse order. The first one is the summit, or the vision. Where do you want the team to be, or the organization to be, the culture to be? Like, again, it's the big summit. Where do you want things to be? The second thing is the strategies you're going to use to actually get to that summit. And that's where a lot of times the conversation stops, because that's where we spend 80, 90, sometimes 100% of our time as leaders is, here's where I need you to go, and here's the strategies we're going to use to get there. And that's where a lot of the narrative is. But the two other S's are almost like the base camp of the mountain. Like, we can't get to the summit unless the base camp is there. And these are the skill sets of ourselves and of our team members. And then the fourth S is the stories we tell ourselves. The stories we tell ourselves, the internal narratives, the mindsets that we actually have that are, frankly, a bigger obstacle than the other 3 combined. So if we don't actually kind of work on this transformation from the inside out as leaders, especially as we're at these inflection points of our careers, like when we go from individual contributor to supervisor, supervisor to manager, manager to director, director to VP, if that's our pathway of choice, and I really hope it's a conscious choice, not a passive choice, but if it's a conscious choice, then at those intersections, we really have to be asking ourselves, what are the stories that are going to get in our way as leaders? Because that will do more harm to us than the other 3 things combined, even if we got the other 3 wrong.
Really good. Let me, Joe, probably about a year ago, you and I did a whole webinar on the impact of coaching and mentoring people. And kind of give us, I thought you did a wonderful job there on that webinar, but tell us the difference between coaching and mentoring, because I know you do a bunch of that. So kind of Give us the difference there.
Yeah, Hayes. This is one where I almost wish that we could all just have selective amnesia around growing up with sports. Because when we think about a coach, we think about, in many cases, somebody who's been there, done that, maybe even played the sport. And now, as a result, right, that coach is now helping us learn how to play the sport. Hayes, I think you used a different example when you were kind of opening earlier. And I think more accurately, that's how I would describe coaching in today's world. As a professional coach, right, as a professional coach or an executive coach, what we're looking for is not somebody who's been there or done that. This is a person who is trained to help you with those stories, them mindsets, the things that are kind of between our ears, limiting beliefs would be another way to put this, the limiting beliefs that might be getting in our way. When we actually don't have clarity of purpose, clarity of direction, those are some of the topical areas that a coach can help you with. Get those things wrong, and then the next things we talk about probably won't matter. A mentor is actually much more skilled and probably more appropriate as the been there, done that person, the kind of trusty mentor who has already been to a destination that you would like to be to, and therefore can help you navigate landmines that you would otherwise step on, or even inside an organization, help you understand the lay of the land so that you don't step on political landmines. But somebody who has actually been there, done that, somebody who's actually done or accomplished things that you want to accomplish, whether it's in a leadership role or a technical role. So very, very different. In fact, it's almost more helpful if a coach has not been in the role that you are seeking so that they don't slip into mentor.
So we need both.
You do need both.
And some of us need more than two.
So you have a personal story of being coached. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, I do have a story about being coached in some of so first of all, I've had a coach next to me for every year of my career except 3. And some of those have been coaches that I've had this extraordinary benefit of companies paying for because I've been part of leadership development programs inside big organizations. And I'll always be grateful to those companies. At other times, I've just, paid for coaches on my own. And those coaches have changed over time. But there hasn't been anything that's actually influenced me more in my career than the coaches I've had next to me throughout my career to change kind of the thoughts and the responses I have to those thoughts as a leader, as I've been growing or changing even my career trajectory and what I thought was important, or finding my purpose, even coming into healthcare as an example. That inflection point and figuring out how to come into healthcare, or choosing to come into healthcare, were huge inflection points. And so I'm happy to share with you with brutal transparency, if it'd be helpful, even what some of those limiting beliefs or stories were for me at points in time.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And also, you were talking about just the importance of that in the development. I'm assuming that it also kind of played over to your personal life. I don't know how that kind of development doesn't wind up reaping positive benefits outside of work as well. So tell it. We've got a little bit of time left, but I really want to hear about some of those limiting beliefs. And then I want to talk before we wrap up about, how we can really make a movement for supply chain here and do something special for the future.
Sure. Just maybe with some real authentic transparency. Let me give you an example of what a limiting belief sounds like. And this is unique to me, but we all have them. One of my limiting beliefs was that it was better to outwork someone because there's always someone smarter. These are profoundly held beliefs that I've had my whole life, and they got formed somewhere, or they got kind of reinforced over time. And so not only is that a belief that I held very, very strongly, but I acted on that belief that it was, when in doubt, work harder. That it was important to make my parents proud of me because of all the sacrifices they made to make me the first person in our entire family to go through college. Right? So there was this kind of built-in knee-jerk kind of reflex that I had that I could never take my foot off the gas from a career standpoint because I had to somehow repay my parents for the extraordinary sacrifices that they made in their lives for me. These are the types of belief systems. And when I say limiting in terms of how they manifest it in my choices, not that the belief itself is inherently limiting, but that how it manifested in my life became limiting because I didn't put boundaries around it. That when opportunity rings, you take the call every time. So as an example, when Intermountain Healthcare asked me to be the chief supply chain officer, of course the answer is yes. I mean, how would it not be? When you're offered a promotion, you take it. In fact, when in doubt, pursue promotion. Climb the ladder to the top. only to recognize that the ladder was leaned up against the wrong wall all along, and you ended up in the wrong building in the wrong city in the wrong country, right? So you don't know it until you get to the top of the ladder. Sometimes these are some of the kind of like what I would say belief systems that are very, very deeply ingrained, that if you don't address them can actually lead you to destinations that are maybe not right for you. And so these are big ones, and they can even be small ones around, I've got to always kind of prove my worthiness by being expert. And turned out as a leader, that's actually incredibly detrimental. As we talked about earlier in this conversation, right? I had to overcome that early on. So those are just some of the kind of what I would say deeply ingrained belief systems that we have to kind of revisit in order for us to have our breakthroughs as leaders.
That's really good stuff, Joe. And thanks for sharing that. That's really, really good. Because again, I work with some, company execs as well. And regardless the size of the company, size of the person, or who you think they really are, they all there's something a little flawed in there once you kind of start digging around the edges. So it's good to hear you say that.
We're all perfectly imperfect.
Yeah,
right?
That's well said.
I think that's what makes this, that's what true vulnerability, I think, really is. Vulnerability is one of these, I think it's a superpower when it's actually, used the right way. And when people can actually really be authentic, and when they can ultimately have accurate levels of self-reflection. And yeah.
I love you said authentic. People could see right through you, no matter what profession you're in. If you could fake it till you make it, is the term that's used, but your authenticity, man, once you lose that trust, you fall back off that ladder, off that wall, start in the moat and try to build it back. I would agree with you so much, Joe, on that.
All right. We got like literally just a minute. This has been a fantastic interview, Joe, but I would be remiss if we didn't say or ask you the question of how can we use developing leaders to really make a movement? Because I feel like supply chain is really on a bit of a trajectory. It's on the rise. It's been on the rise even prior to the pandemic. I mean, honestly, I think the Affordable Care Act is really when we started to see some significant acknowledgement of the work that's being done in supply chain. And it might have even, from your perspective, started before that. But I feel like the change in the fiscal tone of healthcare organizations certainly helped. But honestly, we've got to do more than that. I mean, one thing that supply chain doesn't really have, in my opinion, healthcare supply chain, I should say, is a real culture, right? Like that pride culture. And like, this is something that my business partner with Beyond Clean and the co-host on that podcast talks all about. And he wrote a children's book about sterile processing because that's what it means to have culture. We're going to be releasing a CD of a whole bunch of different types of music and artists about sterile processing so they can share it with their families to build culture. We don't have this in supply chain, not healthcare supply chain. And I just wonder, like, when we talk about creating leaders, what kind of a component can that be as we try to create an inspirational culture that's going to make people want to come to this industry because we need them so badly?
Yeah, Justin, it's a tough thing to answer quickly. What I would say is having inspiration to come into supply chain, if it's not there now, and if we can't harness the power of what we just experienced, and we just had global supply chains, I'm not even saying healthcare, global supply chains melt down in the last couple of years. Everyone now knows what the phrase supply chain means. I used to have to say, hey, I'm Joe, and I, have worked most of my career in this field called supply chain. And I was prepared to then explain what supply chain meant because nobody knew. Now everyone knows what supply chain is. It's amazing how much I think collective understanding it has. We no longer need to fight for relevance. The question is, now that we're in the boardroom, what are we going to do with it? And we've got to create this culture of, I think, not just earning the seat, but keeping the seat. I think Craig Coford has said that several times. How do we keep the seat now that we've earned it? And I think that's actually well said. I really love that Craig says it that way. And how do we make this a destination career, not a place people just kind of like land in, like, I found myself in supply chain, but a destination career of choice, because it is so strategic, so important, and so essential to the success, not just of healthcare, but of any organization in any industry. And I think supply chain has that kind of potential, and it just right now hasn't created that type of what I would say cultural burning platform. Right now, it is still having a different type of burning platform, which is this urgency for change, right? And urgency because, right, the house is on fire. But I think we need to turn that into a cultural fire to say we have a talent crisis, a epic proportion that is brewing, a talent crisis of shortage of people, not the right resources, where people just kind of find themselves versus places that become a place where it becomes a destination. And then how do we, I think, change that into something that becomes meaningful for folks moving forward? I'm actually really optimistic about it. I think it has probably changed forever. My concern would be, and my challenge to the industry would be, this is not the time to play small, even if you're fatigued. This is not the time to go run back to the basement and get out of the spotlight. This is not the time to go back to narratives that sound like, the 7 rights, that it's my job to make sure I get the right product at the right place at the right time. And I can't even repeat the rest of it because I get bored and fall asleep, right? Because it's not strategic. Who cares, right? There has got to be a greater cause than just not failing. Right. And that's what the current cause sounds like.
Love it. Love it. That's money right there. That's money. Great job, Joe. You're a wonderful kind of resource for the whole industry. And I hope people do listen to this and look you up. And because, again, you have a lot to offer that a lot of people, out there that could use your services.
Thank you, Hayes. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Justin. It's been such a pleasure to be here with you guys. Your energy is contagiously positive.
That was Joe Walsh, coach, educator, advisor at Supply Chain Sherpas. Hayes, I know you've known Joe for a while. I'm glad we had a chance to interview him. I have so many notes. There were words in there that really communicated the change in vision versus kind of the cliche of what supply chain is. And I'm going to just anchor on this destination career. That's exactly what needs to happen. Supply chain needs to be a destination career for everybody, and we need to build that culture. And I love one other thing he said, which was not only earning the seat, but how do we keep it? Now that we've elevated this profession, how do we hold the importance? There's so many good nuggets in there. I could go on. I could literally redo the podcast with all the things I learned today.
No question. He is, a walking just resource. He's incredible. And it's basically, I think he ended up saying, don't just fit in, stand out, right? We have a position. Supply chain has now done some wonderful things the last 2.5 years, and let's keep it going. But he is just, I love Joe. Joe's got all kinds of great stories. He's the coaching he does, the mentoring he's done. He's just a wealth of knowledge. So I'm glad everybody, got a chance to listen to him and learn from him today.
Yeah. And that word authenticity and him being genuine enough to share his own personal experiences and where he's struggled so that, hey, you know what? We all go through that. That's a critical part of leadership too. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or simply search for Power Supply in your favorite podcast application. We've also got bonus content for certain episodes, but to access it, you've got to download our smartphone app for iPhone or Android. And while you're there downloading, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to us here at the show. If you have any recommendations for guests or topics on a future episode, just send an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. On behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.